Welcome. My name is Brendan Gillis, and I'm the Manager of Teaching and Learning for the American Historical Association. This webinar is part of AHA Learn, a new series of online programs that provide a forum for compelling ideas and important conversations in history education. And we're so thrilled that you joined us for today's session called 10 Years of C3, the Past, Present, and Future of State Standards. Almost exactly a decade ago, in the fall of 2013, the National Council for the Social Studies published the College, Career, and Civic Life, or C3 framework for social studies state standards. This document, of course, took several years to come together, and it resulted from a collaboration between NCSS, the American Historical Association, and more than a dozen other organizations. As today's conversation will make clear, it continues to influence education policy in states, districts, and classrooms across the country. A few notes about the panel. It will last 1 hour. We'll open with a series of questions about how the C3 framework was developed and implemented, how it affects teachers and curriculum specialists today, and what the future might hold in the wake of renewed backlash against inquiry-based approaches. There should be some time for audience Q&A at the end, and please note that our session is being recorded. Before we begin, let me introduce our moderator. Nick Kryczka is Research Coordinator for the AHA's Mapping the Landscape of Secondary U.S. History Education project. He's taught at Lake Forest College and at the University of Chicago, where he earned a PhD in history in 2019 and worked as a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the social sciences. Prior to this, Nick taught high school social studies for a decade in the Chicago public schools, and he has developed K-12 history curriculum for the Newberry Library and the Chicago Collections Consortium. Nick?
Thanks very much, Brendan. It's really exciting for me to be here with these eyewitnesses to recent history. Let me introduce all three of our panelists very quickly. We are joined here today by Larry Paska, who is the Executive Director of the National Council of Social Studies. He's been a middle school social studies teacher, a school district administrator, and a state curriculum and assessment specialist in New York. He holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of Albany and has served on the executive committees for the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, the National Coalition for History, and the Title IV-A Coalition. Beau Dickenson is the K-12 social science supervisor for Rockingham County Public Schools in Virginia, and previously taught in Shenandoah County and Winchester City Public Schools. He's been an elected president of the Virginia Social Studies Leaders Consortium and was elected to serve on a 2019 Governor's Commission on African American History Education for Virginia's social studies curriculum. Kathy Swan is professor of curriculum and instruction at the University of Kentucky. Swan was awarded University of Kentucky's Great Teacher Award in 2021 and has been four-time recipient of the National Technology Leadership Award in Social Studies Education. Dr. Swan was the project director and lead writer of the C3 framework and has co-written a number of books on inquiry-based curricula that came both before and after that important moment. So I want to start with Kathy because she is a protagonist in this history, and so we want, as the American Historical Association, we want to go back to these original moments, these important chapters in history. So Kathy, would you mind? Can we go back to about 2010? So prior to the actual C3 framework's emergence, this is a moment of high emphasis on standardization, accountability in the education reform movement. There's Common Core, there's No Child Left Behind in the recent past. Tell me a little about what that conversation was like as you understood it when you started getting involved with discussions about nationwide social studies curriculum frameworks.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. It's fun to think back on this period of time and have it in the rear view. I, at the time, was working with CCSSO, and I was working with state social studies consultants from a number of states. And, at that same time, CCSO was shepherding the Common Core. And many of you remember that the Common Core sort of hit America overnight. 42 states with help from Race to the Top funding, adopted the Common Core almost wholesale. And in the Common Core, English literacy, social studies had a place in the back of the document with history, social science standards. And it really struck fear in the hearts of social studies educators across the country, really, that science being funded by the National Science Foundation and others had a big bank of money, and they were busy working on their science standards. And there was crickets in social studies. And so there was this just genuine fear that social studies was going to become an arm of literacy. And there's a big history to that too. And so that was not unfounded. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that, people aren't out to get you. And I think social studies was in a place of going away, frankly, in I guess, the way that it had been thought about for years. And so I say all of that because that fear ended up propelling a series of meetings. And so I think at the time, and I can just be frank that we're 13 years out from this, but I think CCSSO sort of felt sorry for social studies. They didn't know what to do with social studies. They weren't willing to fully fund us. We couldn't find a funder to fund social studies. Nobody wanted to touch it, right? And so all we really had was a coalition of afraid social studies educators, whether that was AHA or NCSS or the civic groups or National Geographic or the state agency folks and teachers across the country. So we ended up in that group under the umbrella of CCSSO, starting to convene a series of meetings around the problem of not having a set of standards that spoke to social studies and the disciplines, not as an arm of literacy, as a way of decoding documents, but as its own discipline. And so anyway, that's how it began, was this series of meetings. And those meetings were hot and contested and fiery. But I think that coalition stood because of just genuine fear. And so out of those first few meetings, one of the jokes that we used to make is CCSSO used to always ask us for a 2-pager. That was always there, for us to move forward. They're like, if you could just get us a 2-pager. And so we're like, all right. So what we first did was we worked on a white paper as a group to try and to define the things that we had in common. So what were the things that these disparate or what seeming disparate disciplines, what did we have in common? And what was clear were a few things, and that we still have that document, that inquiry was a process that sort of held these disciplines together, that a commitment to not just this disciplinary practices like historical thinking, but the commitment to civic outcomes also bound us together. And so, and there were other things too, but that sort of central document then initiated, a writing process. We were able to convince CCSSO with our 2-pager, it ended up being 4-pager, that we were ready to have our own document. And so over the next couple of years, and I'll just truncate this, we started to move different stakeholders together and start to lay out a process. And so there were state education agencies, representatives from that. There was a group of teachers in the field. There were a group of professional organizations like NCSS, like AHA, who named representatives to the writing team. So the initial writing team included 3 people from each of the disciplines, and then people like me who were teacher ed folks that have worked in the field, et cetera. And so over the course of a couple of years, we started to frame out a document that educators, organizations, social studies people had opportunities to comment on. And then over time, that sort of winnowed down to a few key people pulling that document together around the metaphor of the C3 inquiry arc. So ultimately, S.G. Grant, who is at Binghamton, and John Lee, who's at NC State, and I ended up taking those ideas that were born out of that process and ended up sort of pulling them together into what we now know as the C3 framework. And I think what I'll say about that is that one of the things that I'm really proud of that document is it doesn't read like it was written by committee. There are parts of it that I'm like, ooh, I wish we could redo that. And, if you get a couple Kentucky bourbons in me, I'll tell you which parts. But for this webinar, I'll just say that I think that arc is something special that none of the other documents have. It's a strong, powerful idea that not only pulls those disciplines together, but pulls together a process that speaks directly to what happens in classrooms. And that couldn't be done in committee. There's just, anybody who's been on a committee knows how that writing goes. And that ultimately it had to be almost a constitutional convention where, a few people had their hands on it. And so ultimately we were able to get that. And then on the eve of publication, literally on the eve of publication, the Common Core started to get backlash. And I don't know if all of you remember from when that became really powerful to when it became kryptonite. States began running from the Common Core, and there was a real fear on the part of CCSSO that they would be adding kerosene to the fire if they were to publish this document. So I remember them coming into our meeting, we were there, we were at the finish line. Finally, people were genuinely happy in our field. They were like relieved. And CCSSO said, by the way, we're not going to publish this document. You're going to have to find a home. And we were like, great, that's fantastic. And so we sort of had a lot of conversations about that. And ultimately, the home became the home of social studies, which is the National Council for the Social Studies. And so we worked, SG John and I worked with Michael Simpson, who was the editor at the time at NCSS, to sort of bring that document to fruition in September in 2013. And so ultimately, NCSS has shepherded that document over the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. I hope people appreciate just the flash into this particular historical moment. And I really love how Kathy, showed that there was even a change in mood, a political mood from the beginning of when this process started to the moment when it was getting ready to be published, which, historians love contingency. So there are these moments of unpredicted opportunity that have to go a new way at that moment, and they did, that was great. So I want to turn to Larry in a moment about NCSS taking this up thereafter, but I actually want to stay in that distance past just for another moment. If I could ask Beau, who was at that point at around the time, let's imagine a pre-C3 frame environment. You were a teacher. You were working in the classroom, getting extra certifications. How did you see that world of standards and standards making from the kind of classroom perspective at that moment?
I look back on it, it was the watershed moment for social studies. It kind of spoke to a lot of the frustrations that I had and my colleagues had about, we came into the field right after No Child Left Behind. So that was how we learned, the world of teaching and learning as young educators. And I would say, NCLB had a lot of unintended consequences. I think they were most felt in the social studies. So we were trying to navigate that universe of best practice and at the same time, the historic content dilemma that I like to describe in social studies that, when I was going through school as a young person and looking back on it now as a history educator, I don't know if my experience would have differed all that much from my great grandfather's, So it really thinking about how we look at social studies as just content in those previous generations, and being a young educator at the university level, trying to learn these new methodologies. At the same time, trying to balance that with the pressures of NCLB was quite a balancing act for a young teacher. And then when C3 came out, I think I went through national board like 2 years before. And in preparation for today, I actually went back and reread some of those portfolios for national board certification. And in those pages, it's probably the first time I've read those since I submitted them, right? And I was expecting them to be terrible. I was expecting them to be a young, green, inexperienced teacher, but they actually weren't half bad. But in the pages, I could see the articulation of my frustrations with what I was trying to deal with in terms of pressures in the classroom, in the standardization and the accountability world, and what I knew to be good practice and best practice. And I thought C3 came along and just articulated that beautifully. I really see it as a watershed moment for social studies.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. Well, I want to turn to Larry because I think, embedded in Beau's, dig into his own archive, it does reveal that, much of what ends up in the C3 framework didn't come from nowhere. Right? There were other, pretty robust ways of speaking about historical thinking and other disciplinary literacies that were part of a lot of different literature, maybe not a part of every teacher prep program at the time. But Larry, can you talk a little about where you were up to at that moment around the turn of the 2010s, and then you can tell us a little more about what NCSS has done since as the steward of this framework.
Sure. And again, thank you so much to the AHA for this conversation. We really are excited about celebrating the C3 framework's first decade. We're really not, I don't know, calling it a 10th anniversary so much as the first decade, because we do want to see it live and grow and breathe in new ways. But going back to 2010, and I'll give you kind of a perspective from a state level. So I was working at the New York State Education Department at that time. I was the coordinator of technology policy. Our state, like many others, had received a Race to the Top grant, a very sizable grant that had very strong, ambitious goals for curriculum and standards, for teacher evaluation, for professional development. Couple of the areas that I was responsible for was building out funding for virtual learning programs. This was at a time when if I did a presentation and held up my phone and said, look at this, the computing power of, space shuttles is right here in our pocket now. That was a big deal, and we all thought that. Of course, today, if I held up my phone and said, "Can you imagine what you can do with this?" you would say, "Yes, we can actually." So, again, it was this technology was the new frontier. The idea of statewide virtual learning was growing in some places, and then in larger states like New York, maybe not there as much yet. So the idea was, how can we use this funding to leverage growth of virtual learning programs, professional development for teachers, and states like New York. We had extensive professional development for teachers, teacher trainers around implementation of Common Core. In fact, we called our program Engage New York. And the critical thing that Beau mentioned and Kathy kind of described here is this is still in the middle of NCLB. So we are now going on year 8 or 9 of the pretty rapid marginalization of social studies education. Prior to 2002, we were, tracking programs in elementary schools. States like New York had a elementary, middle, and high school series of assessments for graduation requirements. In 2010, I sat at our Board of Regents meeting where They removed the funding for elementary and middle school social studies tests simply because of funding. There was a $15 billion budget deficit in the state, and this was one of the 5 million things we could cut to close that gap. And of course, in the social studies community, there's a lot of horror about how NCLB will continue to erode. And then Race to the Top, the reform agenda itself, seemed to be an opportunity. And yet, when we're sitting in all these trainings, we're seeing this heavy focus on literacy and math. And if a teacher asks the question of, hey, I read the literacy standards for history, social studies, I'm not really clear how we do this. How does this embed? Can you explain it? Oftentimes, I think people were getting the perception or the direct answer of, well, you can just embed literacy right in there. You know, this text on pick your topic, there's your social studies, it's right there. And educators would cringe. We would cringe probably as an association. I know our state council, we would cringe at this idea that, oh, by just doing a bigger literacy block, you get your social studies in that way. And what's really ironic is now here we are, flash forward a decade later, we know that's not good practice. We have education leaders, specialists from every discipline saying the way you do meaningful literacy is by embedding content knowledge in text. And we know that, but we were kind of pushing up against that. So right around this time, I actually became the interim director of curriculum for the state education department. And we were looking at how do we implement the Common Core across all standard areas in a meaningful way. And I speak of this experience in the context of my colleagues in other states where all of us were thinking, how can we use Race to the Top, even if we didn't get Race to the Top funding? How do we use this moment to say we need to do standards reviews of all of our areas? We need to refresh them and make sure that they're rigorous. I do remember SG Grant calling me one day and saying, hey, I'm part of this initiative. We're looking at doing something like a curriculum framework for social studies. And, you know, my answer was, keep me posted. Let me know. Maybe this might be of interest. A couple of years later, it actually became part of our Engage New York program, an entire social studies toolkit that Kathy, SG, and John had worked on. But a lot of states were thinking, how can we create these standards review processes of our own? In New York, we had what were called content review panels, and these were social studies professionals from across the state that met to inform how could we implement standards review in New York, how can we ensure that what's being done in Common Core and all these other areas can influence social studies as well. So I think that was the strength of what was coming out of that particular moment. But Kathy's right, you know, just as all this was happening, by 2013, the floor was coming out already of the perception of Common Core. In 2013, I actually moved into a school district in New York State, and you know, essentially, you did everything but use that word Common Core. You still addressed the standards, all the training and professional learning was around it, valuations were built on it, but we weren't using that phrase. So C3 came out right at a time where marginalization of social studies now potentially getting swept away even further further marginalized by these new set of standards. But then here comes C3 as an antidote to that. So what we as an association have done since that time is, you know, as the publisher, we started in 2016 a partnership with C3 teachers to focus on an inquiry design model institute. That is the inquiry design model that C3 teachers created. We wanted to share that kind of programming with members everywhere to talk about what does inquiry look like? We were proud to see and nurture several other nonprofit organizations around the country that focus on inquiry and social studies, like Inquire Ed. We see the notion of inquiry kind of take hold in programming. I'm really proud of the fact that as an association in 2018, we actually created a vision statement for social studies that incorporates inquiry and informed action as really the vision we see for the world. This is why we exist. And most recently, and I'm proud also to announce that last week, our association announced a new definition for social studies, where the intent of nurturing civic life through inquiry, through action, through the inquiry model, the inquiry process, is part and parcel of how we define social studies. So as an association, we believe that when all of our programming supports inquiry, when our very vision of what we see for the world, for our students, for our educators, when our mission, when all of our activities focus on this, that we think that we're honoring not just the spirit of the inquiry arc, but that we're helping to push against that 20-year tide of marginalization of the profession. It's still an uphill battle, as Kathy mentioned. The funding, you know, a lot of folks, as we know, are very concerned about civic learning and engagement, but the dollars aren't always there. So we've also turned a lot of our work in the past year to not just advocacy for social studies, but how we navigate the political landscape to help keep inquiry front and center, as this is just what human nature is all about. We ask questions, and this is the discipline that helps students get the tools they need to ask and answer good questions about the world around them. So, just to kind of summarize that for now, it is an uphill battle. I think the big challenge that we see is, although C3 has been implemented in many states, either fully or partially in the standards, the new movement that's happening now of doing standards review again. We're a decade later, and let's look at our standards. Now being in an environment where we're also kind of going back to not what we include in our content in our curricula, because often debates about standards at a state level, on a district level, are about what to include and how do we represent everybody's voice. And since we can't, what do we leave on a cutting room floor? The discussion now has turned more towards what should we exclude, and being intentional and legislating exclusion. And that's the area that's different for us now, and that we have to be attentive to as we move into the second decade of C3, is that the C3 inquiry arc does not speak to what you include or not include. It speaks to a process and a way of helping cultivate thinking and learning. And we do answer a lot of questions from the general public about the inquiry arc and how it is marginalizing content, and that's not what it does, and we know that. So just being mindful of what our second decade looks like for advocacy right now.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Larry. And I think we'll come back to. I'd be curious to compare, what Kathy described as hot moments in 2012, 2013 to hot moments today, and whether they seem qualitatively different about what it is that the debates might be about. Well, I want to talk a little more just about the practical implications, present tense. And I think, Beau, you're probably in the best position to be able to talk a little bit about the workaday part of C3, which is to say, district level implementation. We, those of us here at the AHA who research K-12 ed, it's the tough part about studying that is that there's so many different levels of decision making, in the American educational system, from state to district to principal to PLC to individual teacher, and you have eyes on all those levels in your division. So I'm curious. Tell me how you've seen something that was invented at this very national level, like C3. How does that appear in the work that teachers in your district do?
So we've been doing this work for 3 years with Kathy and with C3 teachers, and it's unfolded in a series of phases. And I think that our initial approach was working with curriculum leaders, which I have one of those folks at each building. So working primarily in secondary school. I've started to do some work in elementary as well, but it started with kind of like the department head, but we've kind of reframed that role to be more instructionally focused and less logistically so, of course. So this was an opportunity for them to really dig into curriculum design. And I would say that's maybe one of the initial challenges with inquiry, is that it speaks to everything teachers believe in. So it's an easy sell, I mean, it's just for social studies teachers, C3 is everything that we were yearning for. That's what I was talking about earlier for me personally, but I think that it's, of course, not just me. It was something that our division had been doing in other ways, but it's just such a perfect framework for all the things that we talk about in terms of best practice in the social studies classroom. It compels backwards design and scaffolding and intentionality and how you design the inquiry and set it up. But not everybody is a curriculum writer. And that, I think, was a challenge for some of our folks who believed in it in principle, but were not comfortable necessarily writing an inquiry of like a unit scale. I think that did overwhelm some folks. It's kind of like singer-songwriters, right? Some people are great singers and some people are the songwriters, and you have those rare talents sometimes that are both. Being able to work with that group in conjunction with Kathy, providing PD over the summer and paying folks. Actually, on my part, the logistics was finding the money, of course, to support those efforts. But once I was able to secure funding and pay people to do work over the summer, and find teachers that were willing to do work over the summer and really dig into curriculum design, they were able to build out inquiries that would be a shared experience for everyone in their grade level. It was, of course, the PD and professional development that Kathy provided set the stage for that, obviously, with this particular group of teachers. But then they were able to design it. And I think that spoke to the larger group of not feeling as if it was a top-down initiative of something that I had just selected arbitrarily and pulled off of, bought some prepackaged program and asked them to implement it in their classrooms. They've seen that movie before and probably rightfully skeptical of those efforts. This had a much greater degree of buy-in because it was designed locally. It was vetted with Dr. Swan and her expertise. And then as a PLC, as a professional learning community, all the grade levels, I work in Rockingham County Schools, which is in the central Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. We're like a mid-sized school division. In terms of logistics, it works well for me. I know all of my curriculum leaders. We have 4 high schools, 4 middle schools, 24 schools total. So we're not a huge division to pull something like this off. And that, I think, helped a great deal, in my view, to be able to work with everybody individually and really lead through strength of personality and modeling and through example with this initiative. So then in year 1, everyone had that common experience of implementing that inquiry and then having some reflection and going back and making necessary tweaks. And we've gone through a series of iterations of that, now to the point where I think that we've established a level of trust and comfort that some of the folks that were initially not quite there now have the opportunity to either use that bank that's a vetted a bank of inquiries, or develop their own and have that option now where they feel that they are comfortable enough, they know it well enough, that they can design their own. And that's obviously the ultimate intended learning outcome in the highest degree of ownership, where they start doing some curriculum design themselves, or maybe perhaps they take one of the existing ones and make some tweaks. But meeting everybody where they were really helped out a great deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about, and Kathy, since you're not just at the initiation of this story, you're an active, ongoing developer here. When you go out and lead PD with teachers who are trying to turn these into, let's say, unit-sized experiences that you would call an inquiry, what do you find are, I guess, the ideal circumstances for this model to work, like within a PLC, and where do you sometimes find the need to do more scaffolding or more explanation to get people to that stage of buy-in that Beau was describing?
It's a really good question. And I should say that, I enjoyed this C3 work like a parent enjoys seeing their toddler, but anybody that's a parent knows that you sort of enjoy when they get to be 6, 8. My son's 17 years old, like I don't necessarily want to go back to toddler years. So you kind of age out. So I look back at that time and I think that was an important time. But my happy stage is with, more with teenagers. And so my work, I was a former teacher. I taught for 10 years. My professional life is in the classroom. I'm a professor who teaches methods. And so, I immediately wanted to get out of the political world. That really holds no interest to me from a professional standpoint. And I'm best when I'm working with teachers and with things that impact students in classrooms. And so SG, I'm lucky because SG, Grant, and John Lee are the same sort of thing. And so we created this model to take the ambitions of the ARC and to really translate that to teachers who are teaching the French Revolution or the Civil War or something that's not about a war, something, the Constitutional Convention. And so that required some sort of melding of curricular devices, as well as this sort of ambitions of the inquiry arc. And so we created this thing called the inquiry design model, which is, you know, we say situates between a lesson and a unit plan and is its own thing, you know. And so over the last 10 years, you know, we worked in New York with a major project with Larry's crew, and I've worked in Virginia. And so your original question is what makes it hard, you know, for teachers? What are those points of friction? And I would say, and what makes it better? I think the one thing I would say about that is that I think teachers, me being one of them, are fatigued. Yeah, COVID exacerbated that, but there's always some reform movement going on, and teachers are exhausted from reform. And so I'm tired of being reformed. And so I think the nice thing about inquiry, and I said this on Monday, I did a PD on Monday, I said the great thing about historical thinking, about inquiry, is it was true 100 years ago, it will be true 100 years from now. This is not your fly-by-night sort of reform movement. And so you can trust in it. But that's a point of friction, you know, is teachers sort of fatigue. And I think the second is that administrators, I call it squirrel reform, squirrel. So like teachers probably understand the notion that administrators go to a conference in the summer and then come back and they have a new great idea for you. And so what I think is another point of friction for teachers is when they don't feel that they're staying power to something. And so Beau, for instance, is a joy to work with, because I think the teachers know he's in it, and in it for the long run. They believe him. And so that sort of consistency of message and having somebody at the helm so committed to it, I think helps teachers invest. Now, beyond that, I think inquiry is the hardest thing we do. And so, you know, I don't care if you're a doctoral student or you're a historian or you're a student or you're a teacher, doing inquiry, the big tell for me is when a district or a teacher says, oh, I did inquiry, I've done that. And I'm like, wow, clearly they've never done inquiry, because anybody who's done inquiry knows that it's not a fad. It's not something you're over. You do it for the rest of your life, and you just continue to get better at it. And so I think that is an area of friction as well. And then I think the other fight that I fight here at the University of Kentucky as a teacher ed person is you have to know something in order to construct an inquiry. It's not this, I'll call it dumb because it's 3 o'clock and I'm tired, you know, it's like teacher time, but like it's sort of a dumb distinction between content and skills. And so the comment that I make all the time is you can't inquire about nothing, that you start with the content. There has to be something worth inquiring about that then initiates and animates that inquiry. And I think teachers that struggle most with inquiry are the ones who aren't thinking about their content in that way. And frankly, they haven't had to. They either don't have the academic background to think about it, or they're so concerned about covering content rather than sort of unearthing or investigating or having perspective about that content. And that's sort of the real challenge of it, is trying to get teachers that you know, have a really strong content foundation, and not just they know a lot of stuff, but they're able to open up that content to ideas and questioning and all of that. And that is a perennial struggle in getting teachers not only to design an inquiry, but to implement an inquiry and sort of to understand the historian's project in the K-12 classroom. So
yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I mean, I think you all can agree or disagree with this this thesis here, but I wonder whether the kind of the origin story of C3 was in a moment where there was less public debate of the sort that we see currently around content, which is to say, what is the story of America? Is it one of triumph or tragedy? You know, these kind of intensive, heated culture wars that are part of contemporary politics. Those were certainly not absent in 2010, but they weren't front and center in ed reform media coverage, which allowed some sort of a piece of sorts to kind of create space for this more skills-based approach that launched. But now here we are, where the content question is back center. And I'll put this to Larry first, but how do you see the kind of the strengths of C3 and maybe vulnerabilities of C3, if there are any, with regard to helping teachers navigate the more current politicized debates about what content will be covered and how the story of American past in particular should be, presented?
That's a very hard question to answer in 5 minutes or less. I'll do my best, but I would say first and foremost, because we don't have a national curriculum, and we even struggle to have a national set of standards, the intent of the framework to provide guidance to districts, to states, to be a way for a curricular framework to help. I think it's valid more than ever. It's relevant more than ever and needed more than ever. There seem to be some buzzwords that just trip people up right now. Informed action, taking action in public, working against this perception that what inquiry does is gets all students to be junior protesters and boycotts who are marching down the street. That's not real. What's real is the dimensions of the inquiry arc, where the last dimension is, how do you communicate your conclusion, and how do you communicate it in a way that enables you to take action, whatever that action looks like in your life. And actions aren't always big. Actions can be small. We get tripped up on that. And so, and I think back to, just as Kathy's mentioning, her son, I have kids who are in 5th grade right now. We don't, everything is a question to our kids. Everything's a question to adults. We all just ask questions all day. That's the heart of this framework. And I think that's what it taps into the best, is it taps into our innate desire to just ask and answer questions. And I think back to one of my favorite questions that we talk about in social studies is, does where you live matter? I love that question because you can ask that of a kindergartner, you can ask it of a 12th grader, you can ask it of an adult at a party. You're going to get different answers because you're going to draw upon, wait for it, different sources of evidence to communicate your conclusion. That's the spirit of the inquiry arc. But if I start, like when I start talking to my own kids at home, do you think it matters where you live, is a far more interesting way to start a question that's social studies related, that's geographic reasoning, that's historical thinking, than if I started with saying, hey, we want to sit down today and learn about different places where people live. I'm kind of bored already because I've started that way. I haven't posed it as a challenge. Another question I love to ask is, are rules ever made to be broken? What do you mean rules made to be broken? What a way to ask a young learner to think about how rules are made in the first place. What happens if I don't like a rule? What happens if I decide to break a rule or not break a rule? What happens to me? What's the system around? But again, starting off something with, today, let's learn about the 3 branches of government and how they work at the local, state, and national levels. I mean, again, that our brains don't think that way. We don't wake up in the morning and say, today I want to learn about the 3 branches of government. We probably wake up saying, can I break a rule today? And if so, what would that look like? I'm not saying we should break rules. I'm not endorsing that. But because our brains work that way, and this is tapping into just our innate humanity, I think pivoting the discussion away from defending what is just human nature, inquiry and questions, we're in this position of having to defend right now. And instead just turning that back around and asking people, what kinds of questions have you heard children in your life ask this week? Whether they're your kids at home, kids at school, kids in a supermarket checkout line, kids screaming at a bus terminal, wherever. What's a question you've heard them ask? And does that question, if you were to say, what's one school subject that would help answer that question? We've done this exercise before. I'm going to give you the answer to the cheat answer to it. It's always social studies. The questions always come back down to questions kids ask are about the world around them. So they're constantly asking. And so I love the point, Kathy, you make about this isn't either or. It's not content or skills. It's not this or that. This is about how humanity works, how we best process information, what stimulates us, questions stimulate us, and in taking it from there. And so at the risk of rambling or going, I would say that where we're trying to position ourselves as an association with our members, with social studies professionals broadly, is building a unified message about what inquiry really is, and then having that message go to folks that hear about what we do or don't do, or think we do and don't do, and have them say, oh, that's what you do, that's right, oh, that's great. And our concern right now is, how can we get a message out to a broader public, not just speaking to ourselves, but speaking to again, parents, community members, school board members. A lot of people in professional life have been, well, all of us have been through a social studies class, but many of us have experience as a history teacher, and drawing back on that background and say, remember what you used to do. This is what we do as inquiry in social studies.
I could also, I agree with everything you said, Larry. I could also make a comment about sort of the content piece. And that is, like, I would push back on the premise, Nick, that we're in unique times. I think, you know, when we were doing the C3, you know, first of all, people thought we were insane. I remember my mentors here going, what are you doing? You're going to ruin your career. And I was like, so naive and young that I was like, what? No, I couldn't do that. But anyway, I remember talking about content, and we were so worried of the history wars that we were going to end up on Fox News or some sort of talking show where the thing would be sunk. And it was really, you know, at the point we gathered the disciplinarians of the writing team, the historians were the ones who cautioned us about the content, because they knew very well that we could end up where we are right now. Now, the conversations about content have changed just, you know, a little bit with the advent of CRT and thinking about history from a variety of different perspectives. But those conversations and those sort of potentials existed 13 years ago. And you know, we purposefully did not articulate names, dates, and places. And that was really the historians on the writing team who ultimately wrote Dimension 2 around the processes. And they sort of set the tone, and CCSSO guided us to say, do not get into the name, date, place, event thing, because it will devolve very quickly into that. And we ended up punting on the content for that reason, because we knew it was going to be sort of inflammatory, but also because we really did believe in culturally relevant curriculum and content, that the content might look different if you're in California or Connecticut, and that we needed to give enough space for states to make those decisions that would pertain to the content of their states and to the students in their classrooms. And so anyway, I guess I felt like I had needed to not push back a little bit, but to say that was a conscious decision of fear, but also philosophy around this particular document. But to also say that I think content is important. I just do. And I think when I look at state standards that also punt on the content, I get a little weepy, because I don't think that that's fair to teachers in that state to wonder, what is it that I'm supposed to teach? You outlined how I'm supposed to teach, but you need to give me guidance on what I'm supposed to teach. And so I think, anyway, I'll end there and just say that I think it's not easy, but I think content needs to be articulated. At least some sort of guidance needs to be given to teachers.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great headline. Kathy Swan says, "Don't be afraid of content." So this is good.
No, don't say that.
Well, I want to open it up to questions, but maybe as a real quick final query to Beau, you know, to take you know, Kathy's prompt here. You know, you've had concrete experience in navigating kind of the perspectives of the C3 framework in what we could argue is a pretty content-rich set of state standards in Virginia, and being at the table and trying to meld those two perspectives together. also amidst some of the more politicized culture wars that surround this topic as well. So I don't know if you have observations from that experience that you think would shed light on this topic that we're talking about more generally.
I'm going to identify with Larry's lead in before. I'm going to try to do that briefly. Virginia it just went through this, and I was very much involved in that advocacy effort, very proud of that. We had written inquiry-based standards that would have been a historic shift for Virginia. Virginia's content was probably too content heavy before. And we got caught up in the current political atmosphere that we're finding ourselves in nationally, but Virginia became a national focus of that. When Governor Youngkin was elected, education became a central focus of what his agenda was in the Commonwealth. And it unfortunately devolved into a debate between more inquiry-based standards to the old core knowledge debate. And what Kathy was saying really resonates with me, is that we really need to get the message out that this is not either or, it is both and. I do get frustrated, and I lean more to the side of a thematic conceptual curricula. But I do get frustrated sometimes when people hold up their phone and say, well, content is ubiquitous. Well, it's not ubiquitous in your mind. It may be on your phone, but how do we have standards that honor content, a degree of content knowledge, a reasonable level of content, and still give room for best practice instruction? And that's what I've always talked about. Has been, for social studies, that content dilemma that we've always confronted, and finding the appropriate balance of that, and having a curriculum that is viable and can actually be taught in 180 days. I would love for us to find that balance. And to me, it all goes back to 2013 with, here's the C3 framework that speaks to so many things that social studies teachers were yearning for. And it is a framework for looking at curricula in terms of its viability and what's most important and what is relevant, and really what is going to speak to students in their lives. We can't teach it all. And I think if we get into that game of who's in and who's out, the compromise has always been, well, everybody's in. And then it just becomes not viable. And we go back to the rote problem that we started with in the first place. So around the circle goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, well put. Well, I want to first thank all three of our panelists. This has been really, really great discussion. If people have questions, the chat is now available. So if you'd like to pose some that we can, in our last 5 minutes here, we can chat through any burning questions you might have about C3 as it currently exists, C3 as it was originated, or C3 in the next 10 years, as Larry put it. So I'll wait and see if anybody poses some questions to us here. Okay, so I have a question from Tom Adams. So ethnic studies, another of the disciplines that are out there making incursions or introductions in some district curricula, some state standards. How did that, maybe we can talk about this historically too. Was that at the table at all back in 2013 when the different disciplines that were part of that original table were being discussed? And where do you see it now?
Well, what I can say is that when the C3 was being formed, the CCSSO was like, let's stay with the 4 core: civics, economics, geography, and history. But we knew at the time we needed to engage the social and behavioral sciences as well. And so as we were working through the document, we worked with the American Psychological Association, sociological and anthropological, and those are now were appendices in the C3 that sort of substitute in and use the same format as Dimension 2. And then a few years after, there was a group around religious studies. And that was at a time where NCSS, was kind at that time to engage us as the lead authors to help edit that document, and that was added as an appendix to the document. And so I could see, I mean, like, I think any good document should be living and breathing and not static. And so I think an appendix of some sort, and I don't mean it as a, you know, I'm more of an ancillary or an additional document that would be useful to states to have that articulated as a discipline, I think would be super useful.
And I'll just add to that, if I may, quickly. You know, Tom, this is a great invitation to you that we would love to see content in this area. So if there's an article, a possible conference workshop, a book idea around here's what it looks like to incorporate the inquiry arc in ethnic studies, we would love to talk with you about that. And I agree with Kathy, it's not just a living, breathing document, but in our revised definition of social studies, we talk about ethnic studies as among the disciplines and courses, the grouping of courses that comprise our discipline. I think as we look to the second decade, as our continued understanding of what social studies is as a discipline evolves, it's ripe for this type of interpretation. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple other questions here. There's one about from Brendan about the Educating for American Democracy roadmap. So this is a little more focused on the civic dimensions here. How do you see some of these other larger initiatives connecting with C3? Or now that C3 is there, how have things like EAD connected with it?
EAD has actually been pretty complementary. We were part of the steering committee for the work and on several of the work groups that created it. And there actually was kind of an intersection document of how the roadmap aligns to the C3 framework, and it was intentional. Again, understanding that it was focused on history and civics, but still trying to draw upon inquiry as it's guiding. So we certainly encourage use of the roadmap, and you know, maintain a really strong partnership with the EAD community. At our upcoming conference, you'll see sessions focused on the roadmap there. But again, there is an alignment and an intersection, and I think that was really strong on the roadmap creation team's part, as also a way to foster the C3 framework getting out in more schools.
Yeah.
Nick, I'm going to step in. Unfortunately, as I predicted, there are more questions than we have time to answer today, but our time is running out. I just want to say a quick thank you to all of our panelists. Nick, you were a great moderator, and thanks, Beau, Kathy, and Larry for filling us in on some of the backstory and sharing your thoughts about the future of C3. I'll just add, one of the questions asked whether there were panels about the C3 framework at the NCSS conference coming up in Nashville in a couple of weeks. And there is the opening celebration for the NCSS 103rd annual conference at 8 a.m. on Friday, December 1st. That's how you know social studies teachers planned it. It's at 8. We'll focus on C3, the first decade, with Larry, Kathy, and her colleagues. The AHA, will also host a roundtable discussion focusing on 10 years of C3 at 3:30 p.m. on Saturday, January 6, 2024. At the 137th annual meeting of the AHA in San Francisco. So I hope to see some of you out in the world, either in Nashville or in San Francisco. And there will be many, many more conversations going on in other venues about the second decade of C3, as Larry pointed out. Keep an eye out for a recording of today's events in your inbox and for future information about the AHA Learn series. If you're already a member of the AHA, thank you. If not, we hope you'll consider joining to support work like this very webinar. We'll post a link to the webpage for membership in the chat. And again, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for attending.